Welcome to Energized, a podcast brought to you by GZERO Media's Blue Circle Studio and presented by Enbridge. I'm JJ Ramberg. Energy plays a role in every aspect of our world, but our world is rapidly changing. Competing needs like affordability, energy security, and cleaner, more sustainable options can make the road ahead a little hazy. That's why on this series, we're diving into the complex ideas and innovations shaping the future of energy.
I think without energy security, you really don't have a very successful energy transition, because energy security means reliable, affordable energy. So I think many forgot about energy security.
We're on the precipice of a major global shift. For the first time in history, investments in renewable energy equal those in oil and gas. The mix of resources that run the world literally is constantly evolving. And it's hard to know what the future of energy will look like in the short term or the long term. I'm talking about the energy transition, the global changeover from traditional energy sources like oil and coal to cleaner and greener choices. In this 5-part series, we'll hear from industry leaders and experts and openly talk about how the private and public sectors are adapting to this evolving landscape. Throughout this podcast, you'll be hearing from Enbridge CEO Greg Ebel, who will offer his own expertise on an industry he's been a part of for decades. Later, Greg and I will be talking with one of the foremost thinkers when it comes to energy, geopolitics, and economics, Dan Yergin. But first, I want to check in with Greg himself about how he sees the energy transition. Greg Ebel, the CEO of Enbridge, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Happy to be here. Thanks very much for doing this. Looking forward to the conversation.
So am I. We hear a lot about the energy transition. Enbridge is in the middle of this energy transition. But explain that to me. Once we transition, where are we? Where are we trying to get to?
Well, we use a little bit different word in Enbridge. We call it the energy evolution. Because transition implies it ends, B, that there is a particular endpoint. We have a little different view. And again, trying to take into account where different communities are, different economics are, different economies are, different industries are. We think there's going to be a long-term trend from more fossil-heavy fuels to fossil-lower fuels. And ultimately, hopefully, we can get there at some point in time. No fossil fuels, or fossil fuels that are actually decarbonized, which is pretty incredible, right? We talk about that kind of thing. So it really is trying to get from without negative impacts on social issues, political issues, affordability issues, disadvantaged groups. How do we go from making sure we still have this very cheap energy, but that it's cleaner, more reliable, and more secure? So if you think about it, at least from a North America or a classic Western position, the 19th century was about coal. The 20th century has been about oil. The 21st century is probably going to be about gas. And then beyond, it's going to be renewables. But none of those previous pieces are gone. Coal production is still being done around the world. And as you know, places like China continue to use more and more coal, and it's actually growing. Obviously, oil's still out there, right? Whether you drive a Tesla or you drive a Ford F-150, there's lots of oil in that product. Whether you're using electricity, some of those little electrons may be from renewable, but the vast majority, at least in a North American context, would be from natural gas, or at least the biggest component of that. And those are all going to keep changing over time. So that's why I like to use the word evolution. It's more about how do we get from where we are today to a better spot while maintaining all the benefits that we like. And if we can, in a respectful and just way, bring along other parts of the world faster than we moved in our history.
It's that global angle on the energy transition that made me and Greg want to chat with our guest today. Daniel Yergin is the Vice Chairman of S&P Global and author of The New Map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations. His writing on the history and geopolitics of energy has won a Pulitzer, changed policy, and even earned a glowing review from Bill Gates. I so thoroughly enjoyed your book, The New Map. And you did such a great job giving us the road that energy travels around the globe. And it's changed significantly. I mean, especially over the last 20 years. But one thing is entirely clear, that whoever produces the energy has the power. So can we just start by you giving us a global picture, a big picture right now of who are the big producers?
Well, the big change is the role of the United States. 20 years ago, the United States was the largest importer of oil in the world, and it seemed destined to become the largest importer of natural gas in the world. Fast forward to where we are today, the United States is the world's largest producer of oil and the largest producer of natural gas. So that's changed the global balance. And I would say that it's not just the United States, it's the Western Hemisphere. People don't realize this. Canada is the fourth largest producer of oil in the world. So we've had a rebalancing in global oil and gas from where we were 20 years ago.
It's almost unheard of, that type of move that fast, isn't it? Then both policy change, but just the geopolitics of that fundamentally change how North America, if you include Canada, but the United States, can project power.
I just looked at these numbers. Today, the Western Hemisphere produces more oil than the Middle East. So that is such a big change. And I think actually that for many people, their psychology, their understanding hasn't caught up with this reality, which is a rebalancing, not just in energy supplies, not just a rebalancing in economics. The United States' cost of imported oil has gone down 99%, but it is a geopolitical rebalancing as well.
When you say that people's thinking hasn't caught up, which people? Do you mean sort of the average person on the street, or do you mean governments or business?
That's a very good question. I think the business recognizes it. I think it's not something that's really well recognized across governments, that significance. I think it was a discovery for the Biden administration because it came in very focused just on climate and suddenly found that U.S. natural gas, LNG, was essential for Europe's being able to survive the use of the energy weapon that Vladimir Putin used in terms of he cut off natural gas to Europe to try and break the coalition supporting Ukraine. LNG came to the rescue, liquefied natural gas. Like 40, 50% of that comes from the United States. If it hadn't been for that, Ukraine might have been already conquered. So that's a very concrete example of how it's changed. But I think it was not something that the Biden administration necessarily expected to think about at all when it came in. And I think in terms of, as you say, JJ, typically in people's minds, I don't think the person in the street really recognizes it. Their images are still shaped by what happened 20, 30, and in some cases, 50 years ago.
How much does energy equate to power?
Significantly. It's not only that, it's also computer chips and drone technology and a whole lot of other things, but it continues to be a very significant source of political power.
And don't you think, Dan, that those with energy have the strongest economies, right? I think you can look throughout history. Those with the faster, denser, lighter, cheaper energy have had economic growth, both for individuals and the nation, go so much faster, which does lead to other types of power, right? Military power, trade power, et cetera.
I mean, the U.S. economy, obviously, we have a very big diversified economy in the United States. But this shale revolution, as it's called, in oil and natural gas, has been one very important contributor to the economic well-being of the country. The U.S. was spending like $400 billion a year to import oil 15 years ago. Today, it basically doesn't spend anything.
The shale revolution is covered at length in Dan's book, The New Map. It follows the incredible story of how one small company poured all of its resources into the belief that natural gas could be extracted affordably from shale, a dense rock below the Earth's surface. Eventually, these efforts resulted in major technological breakthroughs in hydraulic fracturing, better known as fracking, and horizontal drilling. As a technology, fracking is pretty controversial. Environmental groups have voiced concerns about fracking's impact on the water supply, on air pollution, and wildlife habitat. However, fracking has also been a boon for the American economy. Before the shale revolution, the United States was producing around 400,000 barrels of shale oil per day. Today, that number has ballooned to 8.32 million barrels, making the U.S. a leading oil and gas producer. But when the scale started to shift, other big oil producers around the world weren't too happy about it.
I can give a specific example because in the new map, I describe an episode where I was in St. Petersburg. I put it in the old days, not where we are today, a decade ago, at their really big global economic conference. Putin was on the stage with the German chancellor, and they said to me, well, you should ask the first question. So I started asking him a question about your budget. You're too dependent on oil and gas revenues. What are you going to do about it? I mentioned shale, and he erupted, started screaming, started saying it's barbaric, it's terrible. And I realized afterwards, and time has proved it right, he saw one, shale would compete with Russian gas, and two, it would increase U.S. influence vis-a-vis Russia in the world. And both of these things have happened, and to a degree that he could not have imagined.
And to your point, the story just came true,
Yeah.
right? It just came true in Europe, where Europe was able to survive what happened with Russia because of the shale revolution and North America being able to export energy there.
Yeah, because Putin thought he could cut off the gas to Europe, which Europe is highly dependent upon. Many people don't realize how dependent Europe was. And he thought he could bring Europe to its knees and get these governments to start to shake and quake and leave the coalition. And as you say, JJ, it failed.
I want to talk about energy security and energy transition. As you said, things have changed so much in the last 20 years with the shale revolution. But now, as we move towards cleaner energy, there's going to be a whole different supply chain. And what does that do to energy security?
I think without energy security, you really don't have a very successful energy transition, because energy security means reliable, affordable energy. If you don't have it, you get reactions, as we're seeing in Europe now at the ballot box. So I think people think about energy transition, many forgot about energy security.
I just want to stop and talk about that for 1 second, because the old thinking was there are kind of like the big bad energy companies, and then there are like the hippies who are like the tree huggers, right? And it is not a dichotomy. It's not one or the other anymore. Somehow, and I think this is what you were saying, this all works together.
There's a blending. I mean, Enbridge is an example of that. There are other companies who are examples of that who are engaged in traditional conventional energy and also in alternative energy. But just the latest numbers just came out. Between 2022 and 2023, the world's share of energy that came from hydrocarbons climbed from something like 82% to like 81.6%. So 0.4%. So I think sometimes the discussions just forget that reality and forget developing worlds. But I think you're right about that. But the second thing is that it is clear that an energy transition is about electrification. And that means minerals becoming much more important. And, copper is the metal of electrification. And suddenly, as you're saying, JJ, you need these new supply chains. You're going to have surging demand. Where you're going to produce it. And oh, by the way, a substantial part of those resources are with Chinese companies, and the processing is concentrated in China. So you have new supply chains that happen to be colliding with this new era of great power competition that we have between the United States and China and Canada and China and other countries, Europe and China. And so you need new supply chains, but there are new geopolitical issues that come with it.
It seems like the word energy security is changing its meaning too, right? I think historically, at least I haven't, and I mean, you're the expert on this, is thought of energy security more in a geopolitical context, the haves and the have-nots and the power. But I think in the last couple of years, for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is the reality of some of the fraying of globalization, but the bigger one is for the average person on the street. And I see this with investors. I see this in Europe, probably the biggest change in places like Germany, where energy security is about me and my affordability, not necessarily about the country's power and stuff. And that constituency is powerful for one reason, right? They're all voters. And I think you see that. So the energy security element, that's the clear and present danger for a lot of people that we forget today, versus the climate, which is an us issue. Security is a me issue, i.e. affordability. And we kind of know how people choose when it's us and me and their family. That's where they choose. And I wonder if policymakers have even figured that out. Energy security means different things to different peoples, and it's much more localized, at least as I talk to people.
What do you think of it as, Dan?
Well, I think that's right. I think that the affordability side of it, as Greg said, has really come to the fore. And we've seen it with voters in Europe. I think there's another element, too, that, in the electric power industry, they talk about reliability. And reliability is really a form of security. And we have another, suddenly, I would say in the last 8 or 9 months with AI, we've suddenly seen, oh my gosh, we're going to need a lot more electricity than we had thought. That data centers now in the United States are maybe 4% of electricity supply. In 5 years, they could be close to 10% of electricity supply. And so how are you going to deliver that? And what's that going to mean for cost? So I'm thinking about energy security in a more holistic way, in a broader way, is quite appropriate and quite helpful and constructive.
How do you all both think of this, though? Because if we look at it from a North American perspective, right now, we're good. On the geopolitical front, we're safe. We're energy producers. If supply chains change as the transition happens, as you're talking about, Dan, how do we start thinking about that now so that we maintain this geopolitical security while maintaining also personal security?
All these issues about energy security, energy transition, but we're also in this era of greater risk. We had a post-Cold War era where kind of the general view was everybody would participate in globalization and do well out of it. Now we're in a different world, and it's a riskier world. And so that then goes right to your question about the supply chains of the energy transition in terms of minerals. And that's a tough problem because an electric car uses 2.5 to 3 times more copper than a conventional car. The bulk of world copper is processed in China. What happens if there is some kind of collision? And we see it suddenly, the US is putting tariffs on electric cars from China. So there's this whole new geopolitical element involved, as your question suggests, that wasn't there even 5 or 6 years ago.
Greg, how do you think about it?
I totally agree with Dan. I think there's an interesting element, too, of we're a very privileged nation. And Western society is wealthy and advanced, and we're constantly trying to do better and go down this, I call energy evolution. You can call it transition. Sometimes that means we impose our values on other places. And where I'm going is that a lot of the folks that we need to stay close with from a supply chain perspective to make sure they don't get into the orbit of the dictators, if you will, are people that are at a different part of the path of energy transition. They may be going from dung and coal to oil and then natural gas. And, some of us might inhale and think, oh dear. But the fact of the matter is, I think we have to be very honest that we need to meet people where they are on energy transition, both domestically but abroad, if we want to keep them in our orbit and make sure we see them as part of us, if you will. I hate to use the us and them kind of situation, part of our economy, part of their own energy security, because there's a lot of nations that don't have these opportunities.
I was chairing a session with a group of African energy ministers. And the minister from Senegal said, we want to build a pipeline. We need a natural gas pipeline so that women can stop spending 2.5 hours a day, 3 hours a day gathering wood, so that we can create economic activity, so we can reduce the pollution that comes from burning wood or dung indoors. But the problem is they can't get financing from European banks because European banks will not finance a natural gas pipeline. But the per capita income in Germany is $60,000. In Senegal, it's $3,000. So they have a really different perspective. And so she says, they won't finance it. What are we supposed to do? And literally, she said, they've taken away the ladder. What are we supposed to do? Jump or fly? And so I think there is a huge perspective gap that you can't project the values of a wealthy Western society on a developing society, which is at a very different stage of economic development. And that's one of the challenges of talking about energy security and energy transition.
It's also a shared planet, right? We all live on the same planet here. And so if there are learnings from one part of the world that you can transfer over to another part, if you give an alternative, right? You can't say you can't have this and there's no alternative. So is there a world where there is a clean alternative that we can be financing around the world in places that might be a little bit behind us economically?
Well, we also have to think about, and we talk about clean energy, but you have to look about where things are produced. Solar panels produced in China are using coal electricity. So, and I think you made this point before, JJ, before, there isn't a sharp dichotomy that you may encounter in much of the kind of public dialogue. So absolutely, you have to work towards those goals of cleaner environment, all the climate things, but do it in a way that doesn't create crises or backlash. If Africa doesn't economically develop, you're going to see a huge migration crisis for Europe. And Africa needs energy security for that development.
Where are the very smart, nuanced conversations happening?
Right here on this series. That's why you're having them.
Well, I mean, because we are balancing an energy revolution, as you say, Greg, with energy security, with not wanting to impose values upon people who haven't had the same fortunes, and geopolitics. There's so much going on at once that who is taking all of this in and making good decisions, rational decisions?
I think there is a rhetoric gap between what is said and enunciated and goals that are being set that are probably going to be difficult to do. I think I see a rethinking now going on about energy transition, recognizing that it is more difficult, doesn't unfold. I mean, in China, they've driven the electric car, 42% of new car sales. Europe, it's a higher rate. It's been around 20%. The penetration's gone down a little bit because they've taken some of the subsidies away. In the US, it's 9%, something like that. And, it's not unfolding as fast as people thought. We could point to a lot of examples, but, there's a lot of debate right now. I think the concentration on technology is actually the most important thing.
I'm actually, JJ, pretty optimistic. Again, lots of discussion. I don't think it's a coordinated discussion. I think it's a mutual understanding of the reality. This isn't going to be cheap. It isn't going to be fast. It probably is going to be all of the above. And we're going to have some humility about this, right? But even in small policy rooms, in small jurisdictions or large jurisdictions, I think there's an out-of-the-camera reality, and probably forced a little bit by the voter that says, yeah, we got to be more straight up on this stuff, right? I mean, we basically told people the energy transition would be cheap and relatively fast, and your costs are going like this.
That is so true. That thing about cost has been, suddenly there's sticker shock that's being continually encountered. You can't do everything at once. I think that maybe in the new map, maybe the most important part of the book is a section just saying that this energy transition is not like any other energy transition that happened before, because all of the others really took a century and there were energy additions. So oil overtakes coal as the world's number one energy source in the 1960s. And today the world uses 3 times as much coal. Last I checked a couple of days ago, I think we have now a $109 trillion world economy. Change that in 25 years is tough. And you take, 4 or 5 of the major developing countries like China and India and Indonesia, they don't even have 2050 goals. Their goals are 2060 or 2070 for net zero, which is probably more realistic. Obviously, there's urgency about all of these issues. I think Greg made the point that there was very easy thinking, just energy transition, you push these buttons and you get there. Now you find out it's more difficult because you're trying to change a $109 trillion world economy.
I just wanted to ask Dan, because Dan's got so many great thoughts on this stuff. Like, do you see something truly economic and scalable, new in the energy world that could happen in the next 10 years? You talked about LNG and gas in North America last 20 years, that big change. But is there anything new? Like, what's really been new since nukes?
I think what's been new is the cost of solar coming way down. And a lot of that is on the back of Chinese manufacturing, which is why the U.S. now is putting more tariffs on Chinese solar panels. Wonderful story in the new map about how Tesla started at a lunch in a fish restaurant in Los Angeles 22 years ago. J.B. Straubel is trying to convince Elon Musk to do an electric airplane. He's not interested, except electric car. He might be interested in that. I think the advent of the electric car has been pretty fast. Of course, it's really driven in China for 2 reasons that don't have to do with climate. One is the Chinese import 75% of their oil. And JJ, that goes back to your original questions. They feel vulnerability about that. And two, China realized it could never catch up with the traditional automobiles competing around the world. They want to dominate electric car sales around the world. And so that's been the real driver of it. And so I think both of those have happened fast. And that's why, Greg, we could spend some time thinking about where the next breakthroughs are going to come from. But the one thing to note about wind and solar, which are, as you know, competitive, but it took them about 30 years to get to the point of being competitive. They were way out there struggling for decades. They were so marginal. And then around 2010, 2011, you start to see them getting competitive.
If we just poured money into wind and solar, though, couldn't that have happened faster?
No, I think the technology needed to improve. And the Chinese drove down the cost of solar, and wind got to greater scale. And I think there is a difference. Greg, you would have a view of this, but there's a difference between wind and solar, too, because wind involves much bigger capital costs. And in fact, inflation and higher interest rates have been a setback for wind. Solar, much less so, because it's not as vulnerable to those factors. And it is just basically one big supply chain for the most part that either runs from China or from Southeast Asia, often Chinese companies, to the United States and to Canada and elsewhere.
Yeah, wind has not benefited to the same extent on the technology front as solar, right? The wind turbines, we're building wind turbines offshore France at Enbridge here. Each wind of those blades, Dan and JJ, are now the equivalent of 3 tail to nose blue whales. Like, you can only get so big on this stuff, right? And then you still have the challenge of intermittency. And hence you get to this issue, legacy fuels and sources of energy are still going to be needed, hence the evolution as opposed to transition. It just seems like that reality will be there. We're making great progress on batteries and all that, but still.
I was going to say that batteries are, maybe the next frontier. When they say energy storage, I mean really storing electricity, because that would then change wind and solar from being intermittent. And so, who's the leader there? It's China.
Totally. The other reality that we're all running into, JJ, is as wind and solar have really taken off, they are running into the exact same challenge as traditional infrastructure, i.e. NIMBYism, right? Not in my backyard. A little known fact, there is one offshore wind facility running in the United States, a rather small one, right? And think about how long we've been at this, Dan.
And I have to add that I was told that there are over 700 localities in the United States that are pushing back against wind and solar development on a local basis. So it's complicated. It's complicated.
I think where we keep ending up is it's complex, but there needs to be a public relations campaign to truly understand what this evolution...
Can I suggest a slightly different word?
Sure.
How about public education?
Sure.
Okay.
Although they're getting educated right now, right? And it gets back to that affordability, Ben. And I think you can educate the public on that. Here's why things are expensive. Here's how we can help manage through this and truly evolve to where we all want to be, lower carbon footprint, cleaner air, all the comments that people throw out like that. So I think people are getting a good education. The issue is, it's going to come back to what does it mean for me, though, doesn't it, JJ?
I think it will. And to your point, those are the voters. But Greg, as the CEO of Enbridge, how much do you think about the question that you asked Dan? Is there something that's going to happen in the next 10 years that was like the next 20 years that we didn't expect that's going to change your whole company?
Yeah, you constantly have to check in the mirror to make sure you're not thinking you're the best looking person in the mirror and there's only one person in the mirror. So constantly doing that, like all good companies. I think we've tried to structure the company thinking about that. It's sort of to Dan's point about how quick things have changed. 20 years ago, Enbridge was basically an oil pipeline. That was basically it. The bulk of the money is still made in oil, then gas, and then in renewables. But it's trying to build a company that paces energy transition. And I think that's a really interesting challenge for policymakers, for companies, for folks like Dan. You want to be on the leading edge, not the bleeding edge. And it involves massive amounts of capital that don't often turn into earnings for a considerable period of time. And if you're a public company, therein lies the challenge, right? So you got to be big, you got to be connected, you got to be everywhere, which big, connected, and everywhere gives you two things: some power, some influence, and a lot of enemies, right? So therein lies the challenge. But we try to think about that all the time. You definitely need to think about the entire change. But I also like to say that sudden change takes a really long time. And I think we're seeing that with oil demand, right? How long has oil demand been expected to peak?
We've been hearing about that for years. And I just got a question this morning comparing two different views on oil demand growth peaking in 2030 or peaking much farther out. And, it's almost, sometimes it seems to me it's almost a theological discussion. We'll find out when we get there.
I want to end this by just asking you both, and it's a big question, so I apologize for giving you such little time to answer it, but what are the most crucial steps governments and businesses, and I'm going to add individuals in this too, need to take to ensure energy security going forward?
From an individual perspective, I still think we should be greatly focused on what we can do as individuals. So whether it's, low flow water heater or showers, whatever the case, I think conservation is a good thing, and it's cheap, and it's probably the easiest. It's good for you and it's good for the world. That's one. And then two, I'm in the infrastructure business, permitting. Doesn't matter what energy source you want. If you can't build it, you can't get it.
I got into this field way back because of that focus on energy efficiency, seeing that as a sort of actually an energy resource. Problem is, it's not very dramatic. There's no beautiful pictures of energy efficiency. But as a country, the U.S. has doubled its GDP, but is much more efficient in its use of energy. So I think that continues, as Greg says, to be a central goal, and that can apply to individuals, and apply to companies, to countries, and always pushing for that and having incentives to do that. I think the other thing is having a more robust notion of energy transition and the complexities of it. And then I think it is investment, and I think continuous, stable investment in R&D, because you don't know, things will come as a surprise. The return of the electric car, everybody thought it was dead with Thomas Edison came back. Shale wasn't possible. It turned out to be possible. So you have to really keep funding things that not only are down the center of the highway, but if I'm going to mix my metaphors, but also left field things.
Believe in the dreamers.
Yeah, exactly. But the obsessive dreamers, the shale revolution was one guy basically just wouldn't stop when everybody said, you're wasting your money, said, I'm going to continue to waste my money. The electric car looked crazy. And, you had the hybrid, which has now come back as something that looked like an also ran, but has now come back. So there's a lot to be done. And it's such a big canvas. There's something for everybody to work on that canvas.
Dan, Greg, this was such an interesting conversation. I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to chat about it with me. I really, really appreciate it.
Well, it's great. We covered a lot, and I think contribute to some clearer thinking about both the opportunities and the complexities. So thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, JJ.
That was Daniel Yergin, Vice Chairman of S&P Global and author of The New Map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations. Thanks so much for joining us today on Energized. I'm JJ Ramberg. To hear more episodes from this series, subscribe to Energized, the Future of Energy, wherever you get your podcasts, or visit gzeromedia.com/energized.
Energized, the Future of Energy, is produced by GZERO's Blue Circle Studios for Enbridge. To learn more about partnership opportunities with GZERO, head to gzeromedia.com/advertise.